Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of podcast Unflooded. Thank you all for joining me. I am joined by special guest Pixel Fusion, a fellow Zelda content creator on YouTube. Pixel, do you want to introduce yourself and your content?
Yeah, I'm Cornelius Belmont, also known as Pixel Fusion Online. I run the Pixel Fusion production channel. I have a few things under my belt that I've been doing. The biggest one being the Let's Talk About series. I also did some podcast of my own for a bit that I called Let's Chat About, where I talked with several big Zelda content creators all for a bit. And outside of that, I also have two lesser projects I call Judgment Time and Zelda AI, which
Mhm.
involve judging characters and then bouncing Zelda content and questions off ChatGPT to see how it responds. Not really into those as much these days.
Interesting, interesting. Well, that's a whole range of content. I really like your kind of let's talk about series where I guess I really respect, especially getting into like the world of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I mean, those are such big maps. There's so much that's kind of easy to miss. I was watching your videos on kind of things that you thought were like mistakes in the map, or especially in the depths. And I thought that it was really interesting, just kind of analysis of the world, the things that you might not think about if you're just approaching it as a player, if you're just thinking about what you can do, in the world, but just kind of looking at it, I thought that was a really cool kind of in depth, um, just look at the world.
It's kind of interesting regarding that because early on when the game first released, there were actually some map errors I learned about recently where little sections showed up on it that weren't supposed to be there and got patched out later.
Mhm.
So these errors do exist in the map, and me pointing them out probably didn't have an effect with what was being viewed online. But there are clearly errors in the design of the game, and at least at the start, Nintendo was trying to clean that up. They might not care anymore.
That's a great question. I mean, it's such a big map. I've wondered a lot. I mean, as someone who's doing their own 3D modeling project, and I have my own organizational kind of methodology for going about creating my map. But like I really always wonder, like, how do they approach a world as big as Hyrule in their new games, in Tears of the Kingdom and in Breath of the Wild? I mean, it's kind of makes sense. Of course, a couple of things would fall through. Just a quick note before we get too far into the podcast. Obviously, my co host Alex was not able to make it to this special guest interview, and I'm glad that we have Pixel Fusion filling his role. But I did receive this note from Alex, so I hope he's okay. I received this message, so let's tune in and see what he has to say.
Hello? Hello? Hey, night four. Congratulations. I knew you could do it. Listen, I may not be around for the next podcast episode. Things are getting kind of bad here. Yeah, I'm glad I recorded those podcast episodes when I could. But yeah, just, if you get a chance, can you just, check the back, in those suits? Oh man, I always wondered what was back there.
You're pretty familiar with maps yourself. I've been keeping an eye on your Hyrule Unflooded content for a bit. It's really ambitious what you're doing because part of me really feels that they did not seriously consider the land of Hyrule beneath the waves. There were a few key locations and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
But what you've been doing is making me think that there may have been some more thought put into it than I initially thought.
Hmm. I really agree. I mean, this is something that kind of the more I dive into the game, like it's not consistent with other games. And I think that that's why it can be confusing and there's things that are controversial. I mean, I'll talk in my videos and I'll find there's a lot of comments where people will think very specifically about like how far north the desert should be. And it's just not consistent from game to game. But I do think within the development of the Wind Waker, the developers had a lot in mind. Maybe not for every island, but a lot more than just is obvious through playing the main quest. I definitely agree with that. That I think they really thought through a lot more than just what's on the surface, right?
And you're right, because a lot of the geography of Hyrule is so all over the place between games. It's not consistent at all. I think Four Swords Adventure is really atrocious, with it being one really big island. And in the case of Wind Waker was created basically as a sequel to Ocarina of Time, if you ask me. Quite possibly the best sequel to Ocarina of Time. So I think there are many aspects of the Ocarina of Time map and mythos that they were specifically setting out to line up. But again, I am surprised to see exactly how much is there that you've been able to, well, unflood.
I mean, and there's so much more, right? I mean, there's so many small islands that I'm trying really hard to think about. Like, I mean, there's not much here to go off of. I think about some of these small places like Crescent Moon Island. There's not much to go off of there, and I don't even know what to do with it yet. Because I mean, there's some obvious stuff with like a place like the Forest Haven. You know exactly how that's connected, or Dragon Roost Island. You know exactly what that's connected to. And some stuff is a little more loose, like Windfall Island. It's like it's loosely connected with Kakariko, but does that really mean it's the same location, or is it just inspired by? I mean, I do think that that's helpful, though, is that there's creative freedom. I mean, there's some stuff that I'm pretty sure about, but there's some stuff where it's like, I don't really know. I just have to make my best guess.
I'm curious, since we're talking about it, the Tower of the Gods. Do you know or have you figured out where that's supposed to have been rising from?
That's a good question. My assumption, because, and this is very much a creative decision, I think, but just because of the placement of the portal going to Hyrule Castle, my assumption is that the Tower of the Gods rose up basically from, where that little portal, shoots you to, from below Hyrule Castle itself. The only reason I'm not sure about that is because, of course, there's also a portal in Ganon's Tower in Wind Waker that takes you to the Forsaken Fortress. Excuse me, the Forsaken Fortress, which is on the other side of the map. So it's like I kind of necessarily have to believe that those portals don't necessarily line up one for one with the size of the Great Sea, because both of those locations, either the castle is much more northwest than I think it would be. And I don't know. Really, I just kind of defaulted as well to Jacob Zachariah's map because he figured out the placement of, I'm using his reference map for my project, and he stuck Hyrule Castle where the Tower of the Gods is. So I'm staying consistent with that.
I suppose the visual for when you go to Hyrule Castle is directly from above it, but I don't know. It seems a little weird for the castle to be right on top of or the tower to be right on top of the castle. Anyhow,
Anyhow, yeah. I'd love to kind of get into your origin as well. If I can, I'd love to kind of ask like how you got started making videos and kind of like, I mean, you really get into a lot of details, and I'd love to know kind of what does your research process look like for creating videos? What inspires your content?
so let me start by saying that I'm a very detail-oriented person, a bit of a perfectionist, really. Before I got started with YouTube videos, I was creating pixel art using I was creating bead art using perler beads and making big frames, doing almost perfect recreations of old graphics from from older pixel games. And that's actually where the Pixel Fusion moniker comes from. But that process, as you might imagine, is a very tedious one. And so I often had things like Netflix or TV shows or YouTube on in the background while I was meticulously putting together these pieces of art. And that's what drew me into watching a lot of Zelda content. This was maybe like around 2018, maybe 2019 or so. I was That's when I really started to get exposed to a lot of these YouTube content creators who were throwing out theory after theory. Up to that point, I had played almost all the games that had come out, and I had my own feelings on the matter. I've been had my own headcanon and theories going back since the 90s about a lot of this. I was around when people were fighting on forums over the days of like if all the links were the same link
Mm,
or if there was a linear timeline or if it actually did branch off long before Wind Waker came along and outright presented a timeline fork.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that too, because even I mean, because I remember growing up, like, and Wind Waker came out, and kind of Twilight Princess came out, and even in the early to mid to late 2000s, before Hyrule Historia came out, there was a lot of discussion on forums, especially. YouTube was still kind of in its infancy then, about the Zelda timeline, especially. I think that's really where I started getting interested in Zelda theory discussion was those forum boards with timeline theories. And it was kind of interesting to see the Hyrule Historia book come out, and it kind of felt like it was like, I mean, maybe Nintendo had it all along, but it kind of felt like it was the forums, it was the fans' theories, put in print, is what it felt like to me. Even though there were differences and there's things that I'm like, oh, we used to debate on this, and I still think our old theories are right. But because the book came out, no one's arguing about it anymore. So there's still some things like that I remember. Do you feel that way about anything? Anything that's like quote unquote now a part of the official canon with Hyrule Historia or the Zelda Encyclopedia that I don't know.
I've always felt that there was a continuity planned out. Zelda 1 to Zelda 2, I think it shows pretty clearly because you can see the section of Zelda 1 in the overworld map itself. But with Zelda Zelda 3, A Link to the Past, I felt like that was an attempt to basically restart, to reimagine the first two games, or at least the first game, with a heavier story. And from there, it always felt like they were building off of that. That Ocarina of Time was supposed to be the past of A Link to the Past. And then from there, they made Wind Waker, or they made Majora's Mask first, which was clearly a continuation of where child Link's story went. But then they made Wind Waker, and that clearly was a forked path. Then they were forced to make Twilight Princess because everybody hated the art style of Wind Waker. Then eventually Skyward Sword came along. And I feel like there's always been an attempt to keep a solid timeline in place. The exception to that, I feel, is when they made Breath of the Wild. I believe they were purposely trying to break away from it, or at least distance themselves enough by putting 10,000 or more years between the games that they wouldn't have to worry about the old timeline stuff, which was dumb on their end. That's not going to work, especially with this fan base. Uh, before Breath, before Tears of the Kingdom came out, I was speculating that Breath of the Wild might follow a timeline that forked off of Skyward Sword's ending
Mm,
in an entirely new timeline. That way, they would not completely discard the old timeline and still have the freedom to basically do whatever they want.
mhm,
I feel like with Twilight or with Tears of the Kingdom, at this point, they've basically undone the connections to Skyward Sword that were ambiguously there in Breath of the Wild. At this point, they want Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom to be its own thing, isolated. But that's my opinion.
I agree. That's definitely my reading of it. And like, I know a lot of people have had timeline theories. There's a lot of other Zelda YouTubers. There's theories I haven't seen yet. So I mean, there's only, I feel like I've only scratched the surface of what the options are. But I've already talked to some people, and I know there's all kinds of theories where people are trying to figure out Tears of the Kingdom story, and it's like, can this still work in the timeline? And it's such a there's so many mental gymnastics you have to do as a fan now. And yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think Nintendo, like, I mean, there's things that they're thinking about. I think they still like their old games. They're not trying to completely distance themselves away from those, but within continuity, it's so loose now that it makes it hard to actually try to connect these dots with the actual history of Hyrule. Um, it makes it tough to theorize about things, but I also think that it's like, with that in mind, it's like, well, I'm just not factoring Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom into my theories now anymore, really.
I've basically, when it comes to making theories about Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I take them on their own merit and try not to connect it unless I'm specifically pointing out how this conflicts and they cannot be canon to the old games.
mhm,
For example, a good one that I like to bring up is a lot of people like to say that the cloud barrier is in place at the start of Tears of the Kingdom, and that's why the Zonai Sky Islands could not be seen.
Ah.
And people also like to claim that at the end of the tutorial, when the light dragon comes up through the clouds, that it is Zelda dispelling the sky barrier. That's not the case because there are books in Lookout Landing, a book that explains that the islands appeared in the sky on the day of the upheaval, which means if there was a sky barrier,
Ah.
which I do think there was a Zonai cloaking field or something like that, that went away when Ganondorf was revived. The light dragon coming up out of the clouds is not getting rid of the Hylian sky barrier from Skyward Sword. It's just, I don't know, parting some clouds so you can see the surface better. But
Mhm.
it's things like that that a lot of people take for granted or just seem to be assuming aspects of the base timeline have to exist in Tears of the Kingdom, when really you should be looking at it the other way, or you should be assuming this is its own continuity until you find something that absolutely connects it, of which there currently is very little.
I guess I'm really curious. What do you think? You know, do you have any thoughts on, I guess, the future of the Zelda franchise? In, I mean, they've kind of reinvented the series with these entries, but I don't think they're going to make games within the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom continuity forever. And I mean, we see in stuff like A Link Between Worlds that there's times when they're willing to kind of go back to old continuities and kind of revamp, do a sequel to a game I never thought would get a sequel. I mean, I don't think that these connections to the timeline are gone forever, I guess is what I'm saying. And do you think that in future Zelda games, there may be something where it's like, oh, this is unambiguously a Twilight Princess sequel, the Twilight are back, or I guess, like, do you have any predictions there?
So I have two big things I would like to see happen. First, I would like Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild to basically be done, that they are done with these two games and go back to the old timeline. Uh, a hope I have right now is that for the upcoming Nintendo console, they are planning a director's version, some sort of completed version of Tears of the Kingdom to promote the new one that has more content. Basically, what was going to be DLC, but implemented in a way that it's now the definitive version. And we would, of course, have to buy a new console and a new version of the game in order to experience it.
Mhm.
It's sort of weird that I'm hoping that's the outcome, but I feel I would like that if only to actually wrap up the current holes in the story. My other hope is that they just realize that the diehard fans really want the old timeline and go back to it. But I don't know if they're going to. I don't know if they want to deal with the baggage of the timeline. They'll probably just make something new that's sort of ambiguously Zelda and maybe sort of related if you try really, really hard. But it would boil down to a new Link running around saving the day in some capacity, sort of generically, whatever.
I agree. I think that's in some way that's going to be the outcome, but I don't know. It's just, it seems to me, and like that for so many different entries that they maintain continuity, and it's, I think sometimes we forget, like, I mean, like, Twilight Princess stood on its own, Wind Waker stood on its own in a way. In distance itself, it wasn't like you know a complete sequel to Ocarina of Time, but it was, and it continued its story, as did Twilight Princess. And all these games did connect to each other. And so it's, I don't know, I don't feel like it'd be that hard to reestablish connections with the timeline and with the series. It's just, and it doesn't have to be like something that's, it doesn't have to look like a sequel to get back into the timeline, I guess.
This is a good segue to something you asked earlier. You were asking why I got into Zelda as a
Mhm.
YouTuber. And there were a lot of different directions I could have gone when I decided to switch over to YouTube videos. I could have gone in the Mega Man direction or Castlevania, considering my last name's literally Belmont, or something else. But the thing that stuck out to me was A, I had played so many of the Zelda games and had a lot of entrenched feelings on them that there was like a lot of things I could say about that basically without having to go and do a ton of homework. And B, the idea of the timeline, how it split, how it broke apart, time travel as a whole, and how it continues to impact things, that was really interesting to me. The idea that each one of these forks has things in it theoretically can that exist in the other. For example, the Twilight Realm may be another realm of existence, either alongside the timeline or forked as well. So the Fallen timeline might have a different version of the Twilight Realm, or it could exist that the Twilight Realm is independent of it. So anytime the Fallen, the child or adult timeline would connect to it, they would ultimately enter into the same location, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
It's one of those things that I need to draw a picture of to try to explain. But there are a lot of interesting concepts like this. And I know now especially that I am thinking far more deeply about this than Nintendo has bothered to.
I feel that a lot sometimes with my project as well, and I'll be thinking about things and having discussions with the audience, and I mean, there's a lot of comments that I'll get where, and I love this, and I'm thankful for this. I want this. I want people to comment when they're like, Joe, I don't think you quite figured out where this location is meant to line up. I don't think you quite got how Hyrule like here's all the evidence to say that this is how the location would be. Here's where it would be. I want that. But like you said, I also feel aware sometimes that I know Nintendo is so loose with Zelda canon and the geography of their world, and all these things with the history of the world. It's not that they don't care, but it's that they're loose with it.
I might be willing to say that they don't care. Not to be too much of a pessimist, but these are large groups of people working on these projects. The open air style requires huge teams to do it. To me, it seems like the map might have been split up and different quadrants, different parts of it were assigned to different people who had different levels of dedication to the project. So sometimes, Ashika Tower, where it was, is solid ground now with nothing underneath. And other times there's a cave under it, and that doesn't really make sense. There's just a lot of inconsistency that could really be chalked up to there were different groups of people working on this that simply didn't communicate or did not have a strong project coordinator, an overseer.
Hmm. Or if there was inconsistency was not a curse word to them, right? It was just like, oh, it's we'll see if people notice.
Of course, people are going to notice in this in this environment.
Exactly, exactly. That's really interesting. Do you think because I wonder just as a player, it's and I don't know, maybe it's not that simple, but there's a way that the quadrants are broken up in game. Do you think that's indicative at all of the way it was designed, the way that it's split up as you unlock different coordinates of the map, or is that more arbitrary, do you think?
So I think from an absolute hard point of view, and by hard I mean like hard mechanical angle, that there's an XY coordinate listing that where the map is broken up basically into chunks. And I know this was the case in Breath of the Wild because I've assembled this map from pieces that were ripped from the Wii U version.
Mm.
And so, at least in those files, it was listed as like A1, A2, A3, and so forth. And I could easily see something like those chunks or a set of chunks being assigned to groups to flesh out, to do things like remove all the Sheik attack and then add in Sky Islands The depths is really interesting to bring up because I think basically what happened there is once they had the new overworld in place, and by new I mean basically the Sheikah technology stripped out from it. But then I feel like they just inverted it and started to modify it from there, which explains oddities like how new water sources have impassable walls in the depths, even though they shouldn't. Things like Lake Mabe over by that I did a video on, to the east of Hyrule Castle, or the water in Gerudo Valley, things that would are new to Tears of the Kingdom that should not be reflected in an ancient typography of an underworld, but for some reason are. Those feel not only like errors, but errors that come about from teams having to make these projects without the proper oversight.
Yeah, those are really good examples. That's interesting. Because you're right, just geographically or geological. I don't know if there's an adjective.
Geologically, I think.
Geologically, that's the word I'm trying to say. Excuse me. Yeah, you're right. That wouldn't make sense at all.
I don't know. I really wish that Nintendo would bring in some of the fan community to basically double check their stuff. Another content creator, Zelda Lore, who I talk a lot with, he mentioned something today that I strongly agree with,
Mhm.
which is that Nintendo needs to hire a lore master, maybe a few, to help them keep track of this if they want to keep going forward. I mean, Sega did that with Sonic. Why can't Nintendo do it?
I totally agree. Yeah, and I think a lot about Nintendo's relationship with fans because I think they listen. I do think as franchises go, I think they're really good about like, I mean, you brought up earlier about how Twilight Princess was a response to fan criticism of the Wind Waker art style. So I think they listen for better and for worse sometimes. But it is something that like as a part of their team, you do need a team, especially when it comes to dealing with this lore. It's so expansive. I mean, you need somebody who's going to be able to care about and keep track of everything. And that's not an easy task, but that's something that a franchise this big, they can afford it.
They absolutely can, especially when I think I heard just today that Tears of the Kingdom has made $19 million in sales or something. Maybe it was 19 million units had been sold, something like that. Like a really huge and unprecedented number for Nintendo properties. It has sold astonishingly well. They can afford to indulge the theorist community, their content creator obsession community to some level.
I totally agree, and I think it's clear through the games that they make that like I mean storytelling is a big part of Zelda, and Tears of the Kingdom like has something to say about its history, but obviously there are inconsistencies. So to me, it seems clear that it's still within their interests as creators to respond to the timeline and the history of the series. It's just not always something that's within their budget. It seems like.
I will say that Tears of the Kingdom does seem built to have listened to some of the criticisms of Breath of the Wild. We have actual dungeons that look different from each other, things like that.
Mhm.
And they were paying attention to some level, but I wish they would have paid attention more. Like it's very clear that the Zelda community wants a solid connection to the past. There are things that are simply not touched on that we want answers to. For example, Hyrule Castle is littered with Triforce emblems. Clearly, the people in the world or of Hyrule Castle knew something about the Triforce, yet it is never mentioned. On the Great Plateau, on the way to the Temple of Time, there are three lesser structures that have the goddess emblems in it, the three golden goddesses. Are the three golden goddesses even a part of this universe? Nobody talks about them, but most people assume that they are. The three dragons are, of course, a huge amount of speculation. Will they ever give us answers? It doesn't look like it right now.
You're right that there's a and who knows, like that's just a separation between I guess the art department and the writers that clearly there's people in the art department that are trying to, show you that no, this is still Hyrule, right? We remember the Golden Goddesses, we remember the Triforce, even if the writing team isn't taking that into account.
Mm. Let me bring up another content creator that I'm fond of, Moxie Watts.
Mhm.
So Moxie, she likes to focus. I was very focused on the bargainer for in the context of it there. So much so that I sort of shied away because I didn't want to step on her toes. But she was very focused on the bargainer. What's going on with the bargainer? Is this some ancient deity? Is it an inverse to goddess Hylia? Who knows? And if I were to take an honest crack at it, I'm honestly of the opinion that the thought process for the bargainer was here is an evil Hylia, and that's it. Like nothing more. Maybe not evil Hylia, but an inverse to it that existed in the depths. There's nothing deeper than that. It's surface level at most. And I wish there was more. I hope there is more, but I honestly don't think there is.
I wonder about that. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Moxie because I'm a fan of their content as well. Because this is how I thought about the Zonai in Breath of the Wild, right? And I still think that that was true within the development of Breath of the Wild. I don't think they had that's my theory as a fan, as someone who played the game. I didn't think there was much defined beyond what was presented in game, even though maybe I'm wrong because there was so much in Tears of the Kingdom that they moved forward with. But my assumption is that that was a response to the interest in the Zonai after the release of the game. Um, but I don't know, and I assume that the same could be true with the Bargainer statue if they want to move forward in future titles with, oh, now that we know people are interested in, let's get into who this character could be. That may be something for future titles, but no, I agree with you. I don't think within Tears of the Kingdom, I think it's all speculation.
Heavy speculation.
I totally agree. We are wrapping up on time. I guess I'd like to ask you one more question, unless you have anything else that you want
Sure.
to bring up.
Go ahead. Good.
So my final question is just, what else can we, to anyone watching your channel, is there any content that we can look forward to coming soon?
So Tears of the Kingdom is 6 months old now. And I feel like I'm running out of things I can really do with it. Not to mention, there's a fair bit of burnout from doing it week after week after week. I have to admit that I'm very appreciative of it because that's what launched my channel from like 700 subscribers to around the 2000 it is now. And I have to appreciate that the new game is what allowed that monetization and general support growth to occur. But it's not something I want to do forever. The well is only so deep, and it feels like a lot of content creators at this point are moving on from it. I mean, just today I saw a tweet from I guess I don't know if they're still called tweets or not, but I saw one from Hyrule Gamer saying that he was feeling like it's time for another Twilight Princess playthrough, and I totally agree. Like I've been wanting to play some other games for a bit, which is why I am now branching over into Final Fantasy stuff, a very passionate aspect of my youth as well, especially with the new Final Fantasy VII game coming out in at the end of February. I really there's a lot to talk about there. So that's where I am. I'm also I'm also considering some Kingdom Hearts stuff, but Kingdom Hearts lore is so convoluted and so deeply embedded. It's a bit intimidating. It's the exact opposite of Zelda, where I feel that Zelda is a bit more superficial with not a lot of deep roots. I feel like with Kingdom Hearts and Tetsuya Nomura's world building, that the roots are so deep you'll never find the bottom.
Mhm.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I know I have a lot of Final Fantasy fans in my audience, so just a note to anyone watching to check out your channel and see if you've by the time this video comes out, who knows, maybe you've already posted something new.
So this upcoming Friday, well, on Fridays in general, is when I'm doing the streams for the Pixel Remaster series. I'm calling it Final Fridays. But next week's video should be the Final Fantasy 1 review.
Hmm.
I'm
Sweet,
not
sweet.
sure I'm not sure when you'll be putting up this video, but on my calendar that would be Wednesday, November 15th.
That'll probably come out before this video does. I'll let you know when this video is slotted to come out. That'll probably be after your video comes out. So everyone listening, go ahead and check out that video now that it's out.
And just one more thing. I was considering jumping over into like the Castlevania Netflix series, right? Have you seen it?
Hmm. I've seen a couple episodes, but I haven't seen the whole thing. But
I was considering doing reviews of the series, like an episode by episode review. Is a bit of a jump away from video games. Well, because it's an actual animated TV series, but that's something I'm considering doing as well. But for now, Final Fantasy is my direction.
nice. Well, that's exciting. A lot of new things for the channel. Well, I'm all out of questions. Unless there's anything else you want to plug. Thank you so much for being on the show.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Great to talk to you at last, everyone. Like I said, go ahead and subscribe. Subscribe to both of our channels. I'm sure there's a couple of y'all listening that aren't subscribed to this channel, so y'all go ahead and make sure that all the subscribe buttons are clicked. But without further ado, thanks for watching.
Have a good day.